Hey everyone, my name's Ben. This is the mini painting page. Now welcome. Today what I want to do is go over how to play a game of Warhammer 40k 10th edition. And rather than go through and just read off the rules from the book to do this, I thought it would actually be best to play a game of Warhammer. So what we're going to be doing is playing through 4 rounds of a Warhammer 40k 10th edition game. And hopefully through doing that, we will touch on all of the important core mechanics, as well as a few extra flavor rules that you come across when playing the game. And if it's something that interests you, hopefully this is enough for you to have the confidence to get some models sorted, go out and play your first game. Now, if you do want to see how this ends up and you want to see and learn how to play what is arguably one of the best science fiction tabletop war games out of the few that are there, then stick around and let's see how the game ends up. For this battle, we're going to be using the 2 forces that come in the Warhammer 40k starter box. On one side, we have the Warriors of the Emperor of Mankind, the Space Marines, genetically enhanced superhumans with some of the best technology the human race has to offer. On the other side, we have the Tyranids, an alien race driven by a central hive mind. To the Tyranids, it doesn't matter if you are an insect on an agricultural world or a member of the largest civilization in the galaxy. At the end of the day, you're just prey. Now, who will win in this 400-point intro game of Warhammer 40k 10th edition? Before we can actually start with a game, there are a few main things that we need to get done. The first thing is we do need armies or things that we can use to represent the models in an army if we don't have models available, but want to get an understanding of how to play a game. The other thing, once we have the models, is some of the auxiliary products that we'll need, such as the rulebook and the additional rulebooks that you can get. The additional rulebooks are supplements for each army, and they are generally known as codexes, and the main rulebook is the central core rulebook for the entire game. With these books, you can essentially have all the rules you need to play whatever army you want. However, there are a few other sources for these. Games Workshop themselves do also have a Warhammer app, and you can obtain codes to unlock the material within the app. Though, unfortunately, this does require still purchasing the codexes, and I believe it's currently behind a paywall. As well as that, there are third-party apps that probably Games Workshop don't like as much, but do achieve essentially the same thing, where you get access to all of the points, all of the rules, and everything like that. Using these rules and codexes, what we would do pre-game is design an army. So for this one, we're doing 400 points. And we would use the points in the rulebooks to design our army using the models that we have available. Besides that, we are going to need a few other things. We're going to need dice or something to roll in order to play the actual game, as well as a tape measure or potentially even a ruler will suffice. Once we've got all of that, we do also need one other thing, which is a location to play. To start off, you can essentially use any open flat area. Something like a dining table is perfect, or if you're particularly agile, possibly the floor. Once we have our large flat area isolated and identified, we can add some places for our men to hide. To start off, we can use various things lying around the house. Books can make great hills or buildings. Tins of beans can make great towers or containers. Your imagination is the limit. After we've been playing for a while, we can look to make our own pieces of terrain out of household items, or potentially even look to acquire some plastic kits and plastic scenery kits like we're using here. Finally, the main thing that we need that I have already partially touched on is the miniatures for the game. As I said before, we can use tokens if we don't have miniatures and we want to get an idea of how to play the game. However, generally, we do want a full army or a unit or something that we can play that is miniatures. It makes up a large portion of the game, as well as it being partially to do with the fact that that's half of the hobby is the building and the painting. So with that in mind, we will need to buy miniatures or acquire miniatures in some particular way. And that can be somewhat daunting. There are a lot of armies that can be played, a lot of armies that can be picked, and a lot of different styles of play. And when you're new, you don't know any of those things. So what I would actually suggest is a bit mundane and what everyone says, but generally pick something that you think is cool, because by picking something that you think is cool, you're more likely to actually pursue painting it, playing with it, and getting involved in the lore and the understanding of the army that you're playing. Before we jump into the actual game, start moving and explaining what we're doing, I thought it would be good just to quickly explain a couple of terms and some of the main core concepts. So, a game of 40k essentially consists of a couple of things. Each player will have a turn, and when both players have taken their turns, that is a battle round. Each player has aspects of their turn that is broken down into various different stages. You first have the command phase, which is essentially an admin phase going through and activating certain rules. You've then got the movement phase, which is where you would move your troops, followed by the shooting phase, where you would shoot your enemies, followed by the charge phase and combat phase, which is where you would run in and start to beat your opponent with whatever melee weapon you have to hand. And if you don't have one to hand, just use your hand. That works perfectly fine in the game. So that is the structure of how it works. Once one person has completed all of those phases, their turn is over. It's the opponent's turn. Once they've done the same, it is the end of that round and we move on. Generally, a game will consist of around 5 to 6 battle rounds, and the rules that I've discussed earlier, the books that you get, will also come with some suggested missions and deployments that help lay out where you would be starting off putting your troops and things like that. So overall, not too bad on that side. Besides that, the other thing to touch on is the information that is stored on a data sheet. And a data sheet is the information on a particular unit, troop, or character. And it essentially tells us how to play with that model or unit, what rules we have to do, and essentially everything we need to be able to play with that model should be on that data sheet with rules that can be referenced if needed. For data sheets, what we want to do is mainly look at the top set of characteristics, which is what we're going to be referencing more often. Here we have M for movement. This is how far a unit can move in a particular turn. We have T for toughness. This is how resilient a model is and how hard it is for damage to get through and actually wound them. We then have the SV, or the armor save. This is a value we need to beat on dice when we take damage, and it represents the armor that a particular model or unit has and the deflection of bullets and blows. We then have W for wounds. This is essentially how much damage each model within a unit can take before it has to be removed from the field. We then have LD for leadership. This is a value that we have to beat in certain circumstances when the rules instruct us to. On a couple of dice, we need to beat that value. Then we have OC for objective control. And this is for each model within the unit, how much weight is behind it when you are contesting an objective where both you and your opponent happen to be on it. Beyond that, the units will vary depending on their equipment and skill set. You may have ranged weapons or melee weapons. These tend to have the same or similar characteristics. With ranged weapons, you will have the range of the weapon. A for the attacks, and this is how many dice each weapon will fire. BS, which is for ballistic skill, or how easy it is going to hit your opponent. And what you want to do is roll over the number in this figure. We then have S for strength, which is used in association with your target's toughness to work out if you've actually done damage. AP, which stands for armor penetration, and this will, if a figure is here, reduce the save of a particular model that you're firing at. And then finally, we have damage. And this is how much damage will be applied to a model for each successful fail of their save. And this is then stacked up against the wounds on a model to decide if they need to be removed. The unit will be prescribed which weapons they have, and you can use the data cards or data sheets to go through and review this. The only other options are abilities, which is some particular unit or characters may have special abilities that no other unit has that will give them benefits in doing certain things. It is always worth checking through a data sheet when using a particular unit, just to make sure that you're not missing any special rule that could be applicable that would benefit you, and making sure that your weapon strength, damage, things like that are all accurate. But that's all contained within a data sheet, which you can get from any of the sources I mentioned earlier, the rule books or the app or some third-party sources. With that pretext done, the only other thing to go over is the setup for this demo game, what we're going to be doing, and how each side can win. In this demo game, how we are going to do it is each army will have a deployment zone, which is going to be roughly a quarter of the entire battlefield. Within their home deployment zone, there is going to be one objective. This will be that particular side's one home objective. If they hold that objective, they will score 1 victory point a turn. There are then 2 objectives within no man's land in the centre of the battlefield. If any side holds any of these objectives, they will score a total of 2 victory points per turn per objective. And then finally, if any team holds their opposing team's home objective, they will score a total of 3 victory points a turn. In order to hold an objective, what needs to happen is the units need to be on top of, so within the ring of the objective, at any point within their command phase or their movement phase. So it is fine to start your command phase on the objective, you count as holding it. Or you can move onto it in your movement phase, you will still count as holding it. And you also count as holding it until an enemy unit takes it off of you, whether that is by contesting it and having more troops, or by you leaving the objective and then taking it away from you untested. So that's how we will score points in this particular game. Let's jump in and see who wins. With all the prelude complete, let's start off with the game. In order to see who goes first, we need to roll off a d6, and whoever wins is the attacker. Generally, the attacker will deploy first unless the mission states otherwise. When deploying, both players take turns starting with the attacker to deploy individual units. These units can either be deployed on the field like the Tyranid forces are here. However, some units have particular special rules and can be set up in reserves or in other manners, such as the Terminators. If they are brought on from reserves, they have a special rule where they can be set up in most places across the battlefield. Or, like the Tyranids here, they have the Von Ryan Leapers, and these are super sneaky aliens that are able to be deployed practically anywhere on the board. All of the rules and options for these deployment methods are detailed within the data cards and the data sheets for each individual unit and model, so that you have that for future reference when using them. It's worth noting that regardless of how they arrive on the field, models within a unit must be set up close to one another in what is known as coherency. What this means is if a unit has less than 7 models, it must be within 2 inches of another single model. If there are more than 7 models, however, then each model must be within 2 inches of 2 other models. This essentially stops you stringing out a massive line of models across your entire army. Once that is sorted and all of our units are deployed and on the field or in reserves, we can roll off to start the game. Both players roll a dice, whoever rolls the highest goes first. In this case, that is the Space Marines, who managed to get the first turn. In the command phase, a couple things do happen. First, all players gain 1 command point. A command point is essentially a point that will gain every turn, unless there's special rules, throughout the game. And we can utilize these to gain special abilities. Each army has certain things they can use these points for, and there are a couple of core available to everyone. However, in this game for ease, we are going to be limiting it to just using it for rerolls of certain things, as well as to fire Overwatch, which is a particular stratagem that all armies have. We also score victory points. However, you can't normally score victory points in the first battle round, which means that at this particular moment, that doesn't matter. So each side goes up a total of 1 command point. Then we have a particular rule the Space Marines have, which is Oath of Moment. This allows us to pick one particular target from our opponent's army, and we will get special benefits when targeting that. Namely, we'll get some rerolls to our attacks. With that done, that does essentially conclude the command phase for the Space Marines. With all that done, we are out of the command phase and we move into the movement phase. For the Space Marines, the only thing on the field that needs to be moved is the Infernus Marines. These move forward off of the objective and into the cover of the ruins which is ahead of them. Without any targets within range or within visibility, there's nothing that we have that we can either shoot at, charge at, or in combat currently to fight with. So there are no additional phases that need to be taken. and we can move straight on to turn 1 for the Tyranids. In the Tyranids turn 1 command phase, both forces go up another command point, giving them both a total of 2. The Tyranids don't have any special abilities to activate in this phase, so we can move across to the movement phase. Here we've got a little bit more action than we did with the Space Marines. We have the Von Ryan Leapers moving forward to capture one of the objectives in No Man's Land, while the Termagants and Winged Prime are moving up the other side of the board towards the other No Man's Land objective. Because the Termagants are not going to be in range of anything to shoot in the shooting phase, we're going to opt to use an action known as advancing. This means that we can roll a dice, add that value to the movement of the unit. Here we rolled a 2 for the Gaunts, meaning that their movement is increased from 6 inches to 8 inches, helping them swarm forwards towards the objective. We are also going to advance the Psychophage forward towards the rear end of the Leapers to add some support to them. It is worth noting that in this game you can pre-measure, so you can make sure that the units that you want to either target are within range of any of your weapons, or consequently, if you want to make sure that you're out of range of being targeted, you can pre-measure that distance as well, just to make sure that you have the best position of your troops. With all of the Tyranids moved forward, we can go into the shooting and the charge phase and the fight phase, none of which are relevant in this particular turn, because all of our Gaunts and all of our Tyranid models that have the ability to shoot have advanced forward, meaning they sacrifice that ability, and none of our units are in range to charge any of the opponents. So therefore we can skip straight through the rest of the turn and move on to Space Marine turn 2. As always, all the players get an additional command point, and this brings both teams to a total of 3 command points. We can then look at the Oath of Moment rule, which allows us in the command phase to pick 1 unit on the table, and we get a special rule to target when we're fighting that. In this turn, we're going to choose the Termagants, as they are a large sprawling unit across the board. This finally brings us to victory points, which can now be scored as this is battle round 2. In this case, the Space Marines score 1 victory point for their home objective. Then we can move on to the movement for Space Marines turn 2, and we're going to be moving the Infernus Marines forward through the ruins of cover and out into range with their flamers. We are also going to take the opportunity to cause a little bit of havoc. As this is the second turn, we now have the ability to bring in any of our reinforcements. In this case, we're going to be bringing down the Terminator squad the Space Marines have kept in reinforcements. They have a rule called Deep Strike, and this is a rule that allows them to be deployed anywhere on the field that is more than 9 inches away from any enemy unit when they come in from the reinforcements. This means that we can drop them in the back line of the Termagants and the Tyranids and all the other models, providing there is a 9-inch gap between where we come down. It's worth noting that this does contribute and count as the movement phase for this unit, so you can't come down and then move, but you can come down and shoot everything that's in range during the shooting phase, which we are going to be jumping into now. Starting off the shooting phase for the Space Marines, I think we'll get our Infernus Marines to burn out those bugs hiding behind the pipes. Checking the distance, we can see that the Leapers are within the 12-inch range of the weapon, so what we want to do for these weapons is roll 5 dice, 1 for each of the Marines and each of the guns that they're firing. In this case, we end up with a total of 23. Normally, we would be rolling to hit with these dice, but as these guns have the torrent rule, this means we hit automatically, as it can be relatively hard to dodge high-speed fire. This means that we can move on to seeing if we wound the Tyranids. In order to do this, it's a simple process of comparing the strength of the given weapon we're using against the toughness of the target we're firing against. If the numbers match, we need to roll a 4. If the strength is more than the toughness, you need a 3. If it's double the toughness, then you only need a 2, and that is how much you would need to wound. The same then applies in reverse. If the toughness is greater than the strength, you need 5s to wound, and if the toughness is twice the value of the strength, you will require 6s to wound. With that in mind, let's roll these dice and see what we do. Our Pyroblasters have a strength of 5 versus the Leaper's toughness of 5. So what we want here is to roll the 23 dice and pick out any values of 4 or higher, leaving us with a total of 15 wounds. This is then the opportunity for the Leapers to save themselves. Each model might have an armor save to represent the reinforced armor of the Space Marines or the chitinous hide of the Tyranids. Looking at the Leapers datasheet, we can see they have a save of 4+. We would then normally look to see if there's anything that can increase or reduce this. The main things that will increase an armor save is going to be things like cover or special bonus rules. The thing that is mainly going to reduce it is going to be armor penetration of a particular weapon. In this case, we don't have any armor penetration on the weapons themselves, so they won't get any reduction to their 4+ save. Normally, they would get a +1 due to being behind a pipe, but as we know by looking at the Pyroblasters rules, they have the ignore cover property, which means on this occasion, the Leapers are relying on a natural 4+ armor save, and rolling these, we managed to make a total of 8 passes, which unfortunately still leaves 7 wounds going through in the form of damage. Now that we know how many armor saves have been failed by the Tyranids, we can move on to seeing how much damage is inflicted to the unit. To do this, we want to look at the weapon and see the damage value. In this case, the Pyroblasters have a damage of 1, meaning that each wound that was failed will inflict 1 damage on the unit. We then look at the Tyranid unit for the Leapers. Going in, we can see that each model within that unit has 3 wounds. So what we would do is apply 1 wound to one model and then apply another wound to the same model and then the same. Once the 3 wounds have been met, we can take that model off. Doing the maths here, you can see that we go through and take off a total of 2 models, which is 6 wounds, and then put the additional last wound that was failed onto the leader of the unit, leaving us with 1 model with 2 wounds remaining. With that successful barbecue undertaken, we can move on to the Terminators, who are going to open up into the Gaunts, who are also our Oath of Moment target. Because we've picked them as our Oath of Moment, we get +1 to hit, and the option to reroll any of our missed hits. And all of these weapons have the rapid fire rule, which allows us to fire additional shots if within half range, which coincidentally we are. After all said and done, what we do is fire 20 Stormbolter shots and 6 Assault Cannon shots, managing to reduce the size of the unit of Gaunts to a mere 5 models. In 1 turn of shooting, we've managed to kill 15 models from the unit. With the shooting phase complete and concluded, that is the second turn for the Space Marines done. We're not going to be doing any charges, so we can move on to turn 2 for the Tyranids. And as per normal with the command phase, both players go up 1 command point, and this gives us a total of 4 command points for each side, and then we have to do victory points. And the Tyranids here start to take a little bit of a lead, scoring 3 victory points, 1 from their initial home objective, and then 2 from the one in No Man's Land that the Leapers managed to take in the first turn. The other thing we have to do, which is now prevalent due to the fact that we have lost more than half of the unit of Gaunts, is a battle shock test. This is what has to be done for any unit or model that has lost half of the wounds within the unit. So if there is a single character with 20 wounds and they suffer 10, they may also have to take a battle shock test. In order to do this, a unit needs to roll 2 dice, and as long as the figure beats the number shown on their data sheet as their LD or leadership, they pass. Looking at the data sheets, we can see that the Gaunts have a leadership value of 8. However, Tyranids also have a special rule called Synapse, and this means providing that they are within range of a friendly unit that also has this rule, they are able to take this test on 3 dice instead of 2. So, rolling these 3 dice, we get a total of 13, meaning the Gaunts pass. Then, doing the same for the Leapers, who are also at less than half strength, we roll and unfortunately get a total of a 7. This means that not only will they lose their objective control ability, so it will go down to 0, meaning that if they're on an objective that's contested, they're not going to be adding any benefit. It also means that we can't target them with any stratagems. So in this game, that means they can't use any rerolls until they pass a future test. With that phase done, all the points updated and all the tests taken, we move into the movement phase. Here we're getting the Tyranid Prime to fly forward with the Gaunts in tow, trying to add some pressure to the Infernus Marines. In order to keep up with the Prime, we are going to be advancing the Gaunts yet again, meaning that we roll that dice and add the value to the movement phase at the cost of being able to shoot or being able to charge. From the other side, we're going to jump the Leapers forward towards the Infernus Marines as well, while the Psychophage pulls a lovely 180 to head backwards to deal with the Terminators that have turned up in the back line. Then it's on to the shooting phase, and in this case we're going to pick the Gaunts. Now, you may remember that the Gaunts actually advance this turn, which normally means that the unit cannot shoot or charge. However, in this particular case, the unit of Gaunts is equipped with a weapon that has a rule or is a class of weapon called an assault weapon or has the assault rule. What this means is that the unit is still able to fire their weapon in a turn that they advanced, meaning that we have the benefit with the Termagants to rapidly progress up the board while still shooting at our foes. So with that in mind, let's shoot some Infernus Marines. What we're going to do is take 5 strength 5 shots and fire that into the Infernus Marines, hitting on 4s, which gives us a total of 4 hits. With strength 5 versus a toughness of 4, we only need 3s to wound, and manage to get all of these wound rolls to go through. This gives the Marines a 3+ save to avoid any damage, and unfortunately there are 2 failed saves here, which would normally lead to a dead Marine given they have 2 wounds each. Instead, what we're going to do is use one of the command points that we've been building up throughout the game to re-roll one of these failed tests, which, when we do that, manages to transform into a 4, meaning that the unit actually only takes 1 point of damage, leaving us with a model with 1 wound, giving us the full firepower, as opposed to if we'd lost 2 wounds in that unit, we would have been down 1 full Marine, and therefore we would have been down their firepower. By doing this and spending that command point, we've been able to get that extra bit of firepower reserved within the unit until it is needed later down the line. That leaves us with the only other thing that can shoot for the Tyranids, which is the Psychophage, and it chooses to spew its attacks all over the Terminators. The weapon has a similar profile to the Pyroblasters held by the Infernus Marines, with the Torrent rule and the Ignore Covers rule. Unfortunately, after rolling 4 dice, we managed to do 3 wounds, but the Terminators have a very impressive save of 2+, which means that we can roll the dice and get a lovely set of 3 dice all over 2, meaning that even though we got 3 wounds, there is no damage to the unit of Terminators. With all this shooting done, we can move on to the next phase, which is going to be the charge phase. And we are in close proximity now to some targets, so let's see what happens with the dice. In the charge phase, we have a couple of different options here. Well, we can do all of them, to be fair. The charges that were available to us is the Prime and the Leapers into the Infernus Marines, as well as the Psychophage into the Terminators. In order to charge, what we need to do is roll 2 dice, add the value together, and then that total value, if it is meeting or beating the distance between the charging and the target unit, we are able to make that charge. In this case, we roll 2 dice and get a 5, meaning that we can get the Leapers into combat with the Infernus Marines. However, there is a special rule that the Infernus Marines are going to opt to use first, which is a stratagem similar to the reroll that we've already used, which is called Fire Overwatch, and allows them to fire at a charging or moving unit as if it was the shooting phase, so they can just completely fire into them. There is a downside, which is you only hit on 6s, not your normal hitting value, but as we know from the Pyroblasters, they have an automatically hitting rule, therefore meaning that we are not affected by this must hit on 6s rule, and it automatically goes through, meaning it is a very powerful use of that stratagem and command point that we're going to be spending in order to use our flamethrowers for a second time. When we charge in, we fire that Overwatch and do unfortunately manage to kill off the Leaper. We roast it, doing a total of 5 wounds that they failed to save. And as this is the last Leaper and only 2 wounds left, there's no way that we can save it. However, we are now able to charge with our Prime. Rolling the dice, we get a 5, which is giving us just enough range to get into combat and rip apart some of those Marines. Finally, we have the Psychophage, and after rolling 2 dice, we don't roll high enough to get into the charge. So therefore, he's not going to be moving, he's basically stalled and we'll have to try again next turn. This brings us nicely into the combat and the fight phase, and the order of combat and activations goes as following. We have models that have the always fight first rule. Some of these will be on the datasheet of the models themselves, but you also get it as default if you are a unit that has charged in your own turn. This means that they get the attacks first, and therefore units with those rules will always fight first. Then what it goes down to the player whose turn it is not. And then from that point you alternate. So the player whose turn it isn't will pick a unit. Once that has been fought, you will then pick a unit if you are the one initiating charges, or it is at least your turn. Here, the prime is charging into the unit, so it will get the first fight rule due to the charge, and we can use the prime talons to attack. Looking at the profile on the datasheet, we can see that we get a total of 6 attacks for the weapons, meaning that we roll 6 dice, needing a 2 or more to hit. This we do manage to hit 5 out of 6. Looking at the strength and toughness, we can see that it is a strength 6 compared to a toughness of 4 for the Space Marines. This means that all we need is 3s to wound due to the higher strength of our prime versus the lower toughness of the Space Marines. Due to the fact that we only needed 3s to hit, out of those 5 attacks that did manage to hit, we managed to get all 5 of them to also wound. Because we are a higher strength against a lower toughness, we needed 3s, and it all went through swimmingly for us. Now it comes down to the Space Marines in order to take their save, to see if they can protect themselves against the damage similar to shooting. If we look at the profile for the weapon, we can see that the talons of the prime have an AP of 1, meaning that the armor save that shows on the Space Marine sheet of a 3+, drops down to a 4, meaning that you will need a 4, 5 or 6 in order to save it as a Space Marine. Rolling the dice, we fail a total of 3. Now, it's worth noting here that I actually misread the sheet initially and thought that these were 1 damage apiece weapon attacks. Turns out they were actually 2 damage apiece. So this would have entirely killed the unit near enough, but it was an error on my mistake and my behalf, and essentially the way that I kind of play this is if you make a mistake, you just carry on and make the best of it. If you're in a tournament, you need to practice the rules, and I can understand it being a little bit more sensitive, but a casual game between friends and family, it's not worth the arguments, in my opinion, at the end of the day. So in this case, I carried on and this turn as if it was 1 damage. We didn't go back retroactively and correct it, but next time I will make sure that I remember the damage is 2 and not 1. Errors aside, the unit fails a total of 3 saves, killing off the model with 1 wound, as well as an entire extra model who still had 2 wounds and is now dead. This reduces the unit down to 3 men, leaving the Marines with 3 men and the opportunity to fight back. Looking at the data sheets, we can see that each model gets 3 attacks. Rolling the 9 dice, we get a total of 6 hits, which in turn translates through to just 1 save on the prime, due to the fact that the prime has a higher toughness than the strength of the weapons. We just need a 4 to make the save, but unfortunately, for the prime, we roll a 3 for the save. Using a command point, we're going to try and re-roll that to not take any damage on our leader for the Tyranids. And as always seems to be the case when I roll a re-roll, we roll it straight back into the exact same number, meaning that we are down a command point as well as a wound on our prime. This is, however, all of the combat that needs to take place in this turn, because the other 2 units that charged, 1 died and 1 didn't make it, meaning that we can move on to Space Marines turn 3. In the Space Marine command phase, both players go up a command point and we update the victory points. On this turn, we're going to use the Oath of Moment to target the Psychophage, as this is the main threat on the Tyranid side of the board. All of the units for the Space Marines are also above half strength, which therefore means we don't need to worry about battle shock morale testing, and we can go straight into the movement phase. To do this, what we're going to do is move the Terminators up to be better positioned in order to shoot and charge later into the turn to do some attacks against that Psychophage. Proceeding with the shooting phase. Here we're going to be targeting the Psychophage with the entire Terminator unit. Speeding through this, we again are within rapid fire range, meaning that we get to fire double the amount of shots, or the amount quoted within the brackets, leading us to have a total of 20 Stormbolter shots into the Psychophage, which, due to the Oath of Moment being affecting that target, we will be hitting on 2s with rerolls. Here we managed to get 19 out of the 20 hits. However, due to the toughness of the Psychophage, which is a value of 9, that is double the strength of a Stormbolter, so therefore we require 6s to wound, leaving us with only 1 wound being caused and failed by the Psychophage. The Assault Cannon does fare slightly better here. It also manages to inflict 1 wound out of the 6 shots, mainly due to the fact that it is strength 6, which meant we only needed 5s and not 6s to wound. However, the resulting armor save for the Psychophage is a success on the roll of a 6. Then we can speed on to the charge phase, and what we're going to do is charge our Terminators into the Psychophage. Now, we've positioned these close enough so that we pretty much can't fail here, but with a roll of 2 dice, we manage to get a roll of a 5, which does not only get us into combat, but allows us to carefully position our Terminators so that they're also touching the objective. And due to the rules for this battle, they then start claiming that from the moment they touch it. So as in the next command phase, we will be able to score some victory points for that turn and that objective. With that done, we are in combat and we can move over to the actual fighting. As before, charging units get to go first. This means that we'll be starting off with the Terminators, who will get to punch out with their power fists against the giant beetle that is the Psychophage. With 4 of them with this weapon, we have a total of 12 attacks against the Psychophage that is our Oath of Moment target, meaning we hit on 2s with rerolls, and in this case, all of them hit. The weapon is Strength 8 versus the Toughness 9 of the Psychophage, meaning we do need 5s to wound, and this results in a total of 6 wounds that need to be saved by the Psychophage. Due to the armor penetration on the power fists against the Psychophage, we now need to adjust their armor. They normally have an armor save of 3+ for the Psychophage, but an AP of 2 reduces it from a 3 to a 4 and then to a 5. We do manage to save half of these saves for the Psychophage, even though it's reduced to a 5 up, and normally these would go through and do 2 damage per failed save onto the Psychophage. However, the Psychophage does have a particular rule called Feel No Pain, which is kind of a secondary save that you can use against each point of damage that the model would take. For the Psychophage, this is a 5+, so what we want to do is roll a dice for each of the damage that we would take, and if we pass this 5+, we would ignore that damage. Doing that, we managed to only take a total of 4 wounds from all of the attacks for the Psychophage, leaving us with just the Sergeant and the Captain from the Space Marines to attack. They lash out with power swords, which have more attacks than the power fists that the rest of the unit have been using. However, the strength of the weapon is less, meaning that we were unable to inflict any further wounds onto the Psychophage. With the Terminators fight concluded, we move over to the Tyranid player as the player whose turn it's not to pick the next combat to fight. And they're going to be picking the Psychophage to kill some Terminators. So as always, we go to the weapon profile and the datasheet for that unit and go through and work on what we can. Here we can see that the attacks are a total of d6 + 1. So we roll a dice, add 1 to it, and that gives us a total of 5 attacks. Here, due to the sheet and the strength and toughness, we require 3s to hit as well as 3s to wound. We end up rolling this and getting a total of 1 wound onto the Terminators, which they need to pass. Naturally, they would have a 2+ save. However, thanks to the AP of this weapon being AP 1, this is reduced down to a 3, not a 2. But unfortunately, they do manage to pass on a 5. With this particular combat done, we then move over to the Space Marine to choose the next, and we move across to the Infernus Marines. They are going to be fighting against the Prime, and once again, this is a similar repeat to last turn. We have 9 attack, hitting on 3s and wounding on 5s. And we managed to do an additional wound onto the Prime. However, the Prime gets its return tax after this, and we remembered the 2 damage this time, leading to a final output of the 2 supporting men with the Sergeant being killed, leaving us with just the 1 Sergeant left in that unit. So it has gone from a total original value of 5 men down to 1. And that's the damaging amount of damage a Prime can do, if you remember to actually reference the sheet and put the right damage down when you're attacking a unit. With the Terminator combat done, we move over to Tyranids turn 3. And in the command phase, as always, both players go up 1 command point, and we review the victory points. And with the center objectives, the Tyranids do manage to get a nice chunk of victory points added to their total. We also need to look at Battle Shock. As we know, the Gaunts are below half strength, and we'll need to take a Battle Shock test. However, we do have Synapse, which is the roll 3 dice rule, as long as we're in range of another unit, and conveniently we are close enough to the Prime to get this benefit. Rolling the dice, we unfortunately fail the battle shock test. With this in mind, what we're going to do is move into the movement phase. So we can pull the Prime out of combat. Withdrawing from combat is a particular move that we can do. You do generally sacrifice the ability to charge or shoot if you fall back from combat. However, it does free you up to move around the board elsewhere. Here we're going to pull the Prime out of combat and fly him towards the home objective of the Space Marines, while we bring the Gaunts round to support with some firepower. After moving everything where they need to be, flying the Prime to the objective and bringing the Gaunts round, we move into the shooting phase, and the only thing we want to do here is fire the 5 remaining flesh borers from the Gaunts into that lone sergeant. This results in a total of 3 hits and 2 wounds. The sergeant does fail both of these wounds and would normally be dead. However, we are going to opt to use the command point for the Space Marines to re-roll one of these saves to try and keep him alive. And we managed to do just that by rolling a 3, meaning that he is left with just 1 wound rather than being completely out of the battle. This leaves us with just the combat phase left to take place, as we are not going to be charging the Gaunts in. We want the Psychophage to strike out, and on the dice roll we get a measly 3 attacks, and are unable to deal any damage to the Terminators for another turn. This leaves the Terminators the ability to smash back with their power fists and their power sword. And they manage to deal an additional 4 wounds to the Psychophage, leaving it with only 3 wounds remaining as we go into the 4th and final round of the Space Marines' turn. We undertake the normal admin phase that comes in the command phase. What we want to do is update our command points and also update our victory points. We now hold our opponent's home objective, but no other objectives, so therefore we score 3 victory points. While our lone sergeant fails his battle shock test, this means that we can't give him any benefits of rerolls or anything like that. So I think the best thing to do is to run him up towards some of the Gaunts and try and get some additional burning done. That does end the movement. With only that 1 unit not in combat, it's the only thing we have to move. So we can go straight into the shooting phase and see if the sergeant on his own is able to burn out the entire unit. And with the roll of a 4, it's not going to be enough to kill the entire unit, but we might be able to do some damage. But when we roll to wound, we unfortunately can see that we only managed to burn 1 model away from the unit, so there is still 4 Gaunts on the battlefield. So we can jump across to the combat phase, where the Psychophage starts us off and continues its past trend of inflicting absolutely no damage to any of the Terminators. So that is that done. We can move over to the Terminators, who manage to, as normal, attack back and unfortunately reduce the Psychophage to 0 wounds, so it needs to be removed from the board. However, this does give us an opportunity to talk about a last benefit that we have from the Psychophage, which is also something that can be applied to larger models and tanks occasionally. It is called Deadly Demise. And this is a rule that allows you to roll a dice when the unit dies, and if you happen to roll a 6, any unit within a certain radius of the model that has this rule, such as our Psychophage here, will take a certain amount of unsavable damage. And this is to represent a tank exploding or a giant bug falling on you as you punch it. In this case, however, the Psychophage continues as it did before, doing absolutely no damage to anything with this as we fail to get a 6. So it essentially just played a nice distraction for the Terminators. This leaves us with the final turn for the Tyranids, and here there's only really one thing that we can do. We're going to pull the Gaunts back to cover the back home objective for the Space Marines, and then we're going to straight up run our Prime into combat and start smashing that last Space Marine to pieces. Due to the Prime being the charging unit, it gets to go first, and with 6 strength 6 attacks, the Prime makes short work of that lonely sergeant, and with that final blow dealt, we end the last round of the demo game. I tried to make this game relatively streamlined. We did cut some of the auxiliary rules around some of the armies and units and things like that. But we can see from this game that there is a very easy way that you can use models and just get down playing a casual game of Warhammer 40k. And I feel that this also shows that you can play in multiple ways. You can play the victory points and the strategies to try and win, or you can try and annihilate your opponent's army. Either one is a viable strategy and may lead you to win the game, and the choice is yours, as well as the army and the paint scheme, which is why I personally think this is a great game. However, if you are getting into this and it's something that you haven't tried before and you're slightly hesitant on how to paint an army or something similar, I would actually suggest checking out this playlist, because this is how I went through and painted the 2 armies you've seen used in today's video and today's battle report. So if you're interested in trying to replicate that, I would suggest checking that out. Otherwise, remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.